My name is Wright. I am the voice of reason. I speak for the Last Crusade. We continue the exploration of strategies to undo the ongoing corruption of civilization. Here, we will look at how to reclaim popular entertainment. There are three basic means to corrupt an institution. The least effective means is coercion. This is usually reserved as a final step, meant to solidify formally what was hitherto informal power, that is, power gains by other means. Before coercion comes persuasion, which in this case is more rightly called temptation. This is when whatever evil policy is being espoused is openly endorsed, and is promoted on the grounds of being reasonable, or inevitable, or practical, or rewarding. Rhetoric, bribery, peer pressure, and so on fall under this means. Such things are used only when the corruption is accepted as a legitimate option and can be discussed openly. Before persuasion is subversion. Persuasion is only feasible when the evil is in the open. Before that point, when the evil cannot be named, deception, propaganda, and misdirection are tactically sound means to move society ever closer to the brink. Confusion, indifference, and spiritual deadness are necessary components of subversion. The proper strategy to retake lost ground is to replace coercion with rule of law, to replace rhetoric with reason, and to replace temptations with incentives to virtue, and then to uplift and glorify our ideals and institutions rather than to demean them. The same three strategies apply to retaking the cinema, which is one of the most insidious, far-reaching, and indirect strongholds dominated by the enemy. Coercion is called for both in the short and long term. As previously mentioned, the get woke, go broke strategy does not work when China, as a monopoly, can pour an endless stream of resources to nullify the will of the American audiences. Resources, that is, stolen and extorted from unimaginable volumes of slave labor. To defend against such lopsided influence requires political action to restore the American audience to the sovereign power of its ticket money. Political action is also needed to restore censorship to the standards proper for a Christian society. The creeping approach of pederasty into modern cinema, and the endless parade of politically correct tokens, not of racial minorities, but of persons who are quote-unquote minorities, only in the sense that the sexual perversion or gender dysphoria afflicts relatively few souls, means that at least some clear standards of censorship must be embraced, alien as this seems to the modern mind. The United States had perfectly robust political debates in all the years when obscenity was both against custom and against law. Obscenity has been against the federal law since the Comstock Act of 1873, and, under Anglo-American common law, has been held to be punishable at law as a breach of the peace since the year 1729 in Dominus Rex v. Curl. Censorship as a legal concept to promote the virtue of the citizens as of a republic, or the subjects of a monarchy, dates back to Roman times. This concept is not new, nor untried, nor are the dangers and necessary limits unknown. While it is commonplace for the confused modern mind to dismiss obscenity standards as arbitrary, and to regard the laws as ineffectual for preventing the spread of public vice, it is interesting to note that contraception and infanticide, as promoted for example by Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, were condemned by the obscenity laws of their day. Censorship is not this elastic community standards which censors only political thoughts displeasing to Big Brother. However, legal censorship, as written in the black letter law, is nothing if the spirit of the time will not support, sustain, and promote it. There is no law in the United States against using swear words, albeit there are FTC regulations forbidding their use on radio, and at one time those rules held sway. Nonetheless, before the corruption of the language by vulgarities, intended by the enemy to demoralize and erode the atmosphere of civility which is necessary for public discourse, especially when women and children are present, while not against the law, even the use of vulgarities now regarded as comically mild, such as the damn uttered by Rhett Butler in the famous final scene of Gone with the Wind, was a breach of civility, and was discouraged by the firm custom of that generation. No black letter law was needed. the incentives of public shame and private rebuke were sufficient. Censorship cannot be reimposed at once, as it was not removed at once, but gradually, as a matter of custom, as a living spirit of the time, before it can be written into a black-letter law. This requires a return to decency, which in turn requires the conversion of sinners to Christianity. Christianity, more so than any other religion in history, made both human life and human sexuality sacred and glorious, and tamed its destructive wildness into a spirit of romance, as seen in our poems and plays and songs, and into the institution of monogamy, which no single institution has been the source of more human happiness in any land or generation. Before censorship can be imposed, persuasion must be successful. Incentives are called for. Artists since before Orpheus strummed the lyre or Homer sang have ventured beyond what is traditionally acceptable or safe. Even strict Victorians allowed their artists and sculptors to depict nudes, a privilege granted no one else. So the artistic community, even in a healthy society, will always tend toward more and more daring and titillating portrayals of morally questionable behavior. This is because art requires drama, and drama requires conflict, from which the sins of man cannot be severed. The artistic community cannot and will not restrict itself to the wholesome and traditional, unless their patrons and paying customers enforce a prompt and clear standard. The customer has a duty to uphold public decency, which cannot be delegated to another, nor shirked. Not only must the ideals of human decency, chastity, and normal sexual behavior, love and romance and so on, be defended in the academic areas where they have been entirely defamed, the artistic spirit in Hollywood must be broken as with spur and whip to serve what is highest, best, brightest, and most holy in the human spirit, and in nature, and in heaven, rather than churning out ghastly torture porn and eye-rollingly dull, woke-scold propaganda. As the American consumer regains the sovereign power over extensive industries the anarchist, globalist, plutocrat alliance slowly but surely has usurped from us, we must take care to use that power not just for our own short-term satisfaction, but also in loyalty to the long-term and abstract goals we prize. The enemy has held a sick vision or worldview before its partisans for decades, if not centuries. This vision is of a secular utopia, one where, once all religion is abolished, all acts shall be licit. Once government is abolished, all men will live together in peace like angels, without law or need for law. Once economic is abolished, poverty, want, and scarcity of resources will softly and silently vanish away, and wealth pour from the clouds for no reason, and all will be rejoicing in the endless festivities, neither marrying nor being given in marriage. The other promises are merely idle or silly. It is lust, the lust of the eyes, glaring at what others possess, which provides the main appeal of this utopia. Living without church and state, where all goods are free, may appeal to an intellectual. But the selling point of the utopia is the lifelong worldwide orgy, like the paradise of Mahound, complete with Hori. The vision is never openly promoted. It is merely implied, merely adumbrated, merely offered as hints. In the subversion stage, no one sets about to say that divorce and adultery are better for women than monogamy and true love. Stated baldly, the proposition is absurd. Instead, stories portraying marriage as dissatisfying and empty dead ends, and divorce and adultery as glamorous and practical, harmless to children, and not deleterious to the community, are put forward. In the subversion stage, no one tells the young men not to remain virgins until marriage. Indeed, no one speaks of virginity in marriage at all at this stage, except perhaps to make it the butt of a joke. Men will naturally sin. They need no urging. All they need is not hear what the wages of sin are, and they'll do it. Hence, all that subversive movies, books, and shows need do is to portray life at the Playboy Mansion, where the restrictions of religion are forsworn, as glamorous, and to hint that such a life awaits us all, once we toss away the irrational restrictions imposed by Victorian maiden aunts. This subversion is done subtly over long periods. Little surprises and sucker punches have been sneaked into popular entertainments at every level, without pause or let, for more years than suspected. I remember in my youth reading a superhero comic where, as a throwaway line, a giant image of Ken Starr was jokingly cast by a psychic illusion as a nightmare sufficient to terrify and disperse a crowd of random people, as if all were perjurers and adulterers. routinely words from Bush or Trump put into the mouths of supervillains. These funny books are aimed at the young, who are unlikely to catch the specific reference. But the mood, the unspoken assumption, the bias of the writer can pass into the soul of the audience almost without their awareness. Can we not erect a healthy vision of the world to do the same? The process of subversion by such slow degrees is often likened to boiling a frog. The frog's primitive nervous system cannot register temperature, except by relative change, so that if the heat creeps up slowly enough beneath the pot, it can be raised to boil without the frog ever registering the pain. We need not act slowly, because we need not hide our long-term goals. One must boil a frog slowly, but a refreshing plunge into an ice-cold mountain stream can both clean the flesh and shock the sleepy soul awake. Most parents want their children to be raised decently. They would prefer decent books and shows to be available if it were possible. The promotion of sexual deviance to children is not something being done at the behest of the general public. It is being done through institutions, through schools and libraries, and especially through the entertainment industry. These institutions are so thoroughly woke that, so corrupt that, they can no longer perform their core functions. The schools cannot teach, they are too busy promoting sodomy. The entertainment industry cannot make movies, they are too busy preparing boring Mary Sue stories meant to spread and glorify feminist woke scoldery. Pressure groups and activist groups for every form of sin and evil can be found at large in the public, using whatever influence they can to garner, or lure, or shove, or pressure, or persuade the immense worldwide propaganda apparatus called Hollywood to favor and support their causes, from communism to atheism to sodomy to pederasty to animal rights to anti-fracking. Such is their right in America, but those who support truth, beauty, and virtue do not do likewise. I will not here and now detail how to begin such a movement or how to fund and organize such a effort. Political action and consumer advocacy have a long and storied history in this nation, and most adults can find advice on how to embark on such projects from wiser heads than mine. The disadvantage we may never overcome, of course, is that wealthy patrons among the plutocrats and permanent donor class of politics, the media elite, and so on, can outspend and outweight any grassroots effort. More than sporadic grassroots action is needed. Major political figures, philanthropic organizations, think tanks, and businesses eager for positive publicity must be persuaded to join in such efforts. If the National Rifle Association can sustain a large-scale and endless assault on the Second Amendment, a citizens' committee organized for the promotion of public decency could also. Such things at one time were quite common. You have no doubt heard of them, denounced with sneers and mockery by everyone from James Joyce to James Brent's Cabell to Mae West. Well, the forces of corruption won a signal victory over Hollywood, and in a matter of 2 generations, decent films were a thing of the past, and the red propaganda was commonplace. Now it is anti-American, anti-Caucasian, anti-Christian propaganda, and a studied replacement of all the beloved long-running franchises with the woke scold and dreary mockeries. We have lost Star Wars and have instead The Last Jedi. Instead of Narnia, we have The Golden Compass. Instead of Gandalf the Grey, we have Dumbledore the Gay. Instead of enduring classics, we have dumpster fires of tasteless, plotless, dreary puke. Can this trend be reversed? Well, why not? When a clock is wrong, it must be turned back, or else the time will never be right. Certainly it is harder to build a tower than to knock it down, but the work can be done one brick at a time, with one hand holding the trowel and the other wielding the sword. The work is slow because the enemy will send minions to tear the bricks away as soon as they go in. But no laws of history are written in stone. No set of economic incentives make anything so inevitable or so likely that some other set of incentives cannot reverse the tendency. The enemy speaks always and forever as if history were a goddess who takes sides and separates her blessed children on her right side from those cursed with eventual defeat and obscurity, banished to her left, the wrong side of history. Nothing could be further from the truth. History is not a science like physics because human beings are not inanimate atoms controlled by atomic forces. Each part of human history is decreed and decided upon by the free will of men who act, decided upon by their grit, by their determination, by their luck, and by the situation on the ground. A crusade to uphold public decency and to restore civilized standards to film are no more unlikely or absurd than a Marxist American Party, except that we need not hide our long-term goals behind absurd-sounding slogans, as the Marxist Party called Black Lives Matter had to do. Conservative artists must make art, and conservative patrons must patronize, buy, and support it. Those who say that art is innately anarchistic and progressive, and must forever seek creative, hence new forms, merely misstate the case. Love songs are as old as songs, and art has drama only when it adheres to traditional forms and only when it speaks to eternal truths. Hence, a third and final step is this: the conquest of Hollywood by those among us with the wealth, time, and talent to create profound art and popular entertainment. We must start film companies and find financial backing explicitly designed to exclude SJWs and their woke scoldery. Frankly, the only way under the current regime to do so that I can see for discriminating against left-wingers, anarchists, and perverts, without running afoul of the Civil Rights Act, is to form a company as a conspicuously religious organization, and to put a bishop or something in charge of it. This would allow the companies to stand by a rule that they will hire no one in any capacity who is outside what the church would accept as presenting himself for communion, namely, no one who supports abortion or has had one. Sadly, the Civil Rights Act must be repealed. The authority of the federal government to intervene in the private sphere among vendors and employers, establishing de facto quotas based on victim group status, is the paramount cause of identity politics. Without this well-meaning but legally insane abomination, so alien to the American spirit, the corporate culture would not be, and could not have become, so un-American. And that includes the corporate giants running the entertainment monopolies. Whatever the intent originally of the Civil Rights Act, by making discrimination, an invisible mental act, the basis for legal action, or in other words, a thought crime, one grants to elected officials and unelected bureaucrats an arbitrary and dangerous power that can be, and as it turns out has been, used to make any thoughts displeasing to those in power illegal. The current state of the law, under the wording of the Civil Rights Act, allows the state to compel active cooperation with sins forbidden by human law and divine law through all prior generations. The Christian cake baker or wedding planner or reception hall landlord willing to defy this law is so rare that activists must take extraordinary pains to find him. Once found, the activists use this law to harass and abuse the Christian without mercy. The right of adhering strictly to Christian standards, as when one does not cooperate with glorifying sodomy, is not one Christians are permitted to exercise under the civil rights law. But the right to abolish any man who adheres strictly to Christian standards from public life, or abolish his private livelihood, is permitted to the anti-Christian. The law, as it currently stands, offers religious men no clear way to avoid active cooperation with grave moral evils their religion forbids. Perhaps indeed, discrimination by Democrats and Jim Crow laws against blacks should be outlawed. The most obvious and direct way to do this would be to outlaw Jim Crow laws, that is, to leave each bus line and sandwich counter free to serve any customer or hire any employee, each owner as he sees fit. The next most obvious way would be to outlaw Democrats. Treason, after all, is illegal, and sedition at sometimes has been. But if instead the way meant to deter this discrimination is to grant politicians and bureaucrats the power to judge thought crime, an invisible mental act, this creates an inevitable incentive to corruption. Granting the federal government the right to compel bus lines and sandwich counters to serve customers or to hire employees according to an unstated and ever-changing quota inevitably leads and has led to corruption. The mandate against discrimination now extends to other identitarian groups, including groups of sexual deviants whose peccadillos render them unfit to be patrons or employees. The madness has grown beyond merely forcing Hooters to hire male waiters. It is at the point where the Boy Scouts, an organization specifically founded to teach boys elevated moral character, are forced to have pederast or transvestite or sodomite scoutmasters. It has forced transvestites into women's locker rooms and into the winner's circle of every sort of all-girl sports. This corruption was foreseen, The generation who embraced the Civil Rights Act was warned at the time. The warning voices were shouted down and called racist. Under the foolish and vague wording of the Civil Rights Act, all other constitutional restrictions on federal overreach are now null and void. No speech is beyond regulation, because any speech can be called hate speech. No church is beyond persecution, when the church preaches against sodomy, and no business is free to be run as its owner sees fit. All the power-hungry need to do is decree the thought of whoever obstructs their path to power be thinking discrimination, be thinking thought crime, be thinking double plus ungood thoughts, be thinking illegal thoughts. Once the speech of everyone in favor of free speech is defined as hate speech, that is, unacceptable discrimination, the Civil Rights Act allows, if not promotes, forbidding free speech in the name of promoting correct thought. Christianity now and has forever been the sole social force able to diminish tyranny and mob rule alike. Despite being the source of our culture and our common law, Christianity must be and has been misinterpreted to be in conflict with the Civil Rights Act, so that the power-hungry can diminish Christian influence in society and render our core tenets unlawful. If you think this exaggeration, please consider. A recent case before the Supreme Court was decided that it was forbidden under the Civil Rights Act to discriminate against a transvestite on the grounds that one cannot discriminate against a qualified female. This was decided not on any judicial logic, but on a bit of wordplay more akin to a pun than on legal reasoning. If it is a thought crime to fire a qualified woman solely because she's a woman, this court held it is also a thought crime to fire a man who dons a dress and puts on lipstick, solely because he is not the woman he also pretends he is. In both cases, the word sex was somewhere in the legal decision, and so therefore the judge decided that that was the original intent of the law, and that was what the legislators had in mind when the law was penned. Like all such legally subversive decisions, there is, of course, not a single prior case, not even dicta, which can be quoted in support of this absurd legal argument. It was legislating from the bench, pure and simple. The court has held that a law preventing discrimination against women, regardless of the legal intent of the lawmaker, as a matter of constitutional principle, now prevents discrimination against insane people, provided the insanity is to hallucinate being a woman when you're not. This type of insanity would not be possible if the entertainment industry had not, with remarkable diligence since the 1950s, promoted the ungodly and ugly principles of what can be called the total pornography culture. This includes especially the idea that all sick and abnormal sources of pleasure, provided only they are sources of sexual pleasure, are not only normal and tolerable, but brave and glorious and richly to be celebrated. Under the vision of the total pornography culture, sexual perversion is more than merely normal. The total pornography culture holds that neither God nor man has the right to forbid, deter, or even to hold an adverse opinion on the question of whether sexual perversion, adultery, fornication, contraception, abortion may or may not have deleterious effects, and may or may not violate the moral order. In my youth, I would have stated the idea that the total pornography culture supported was the idea that all private things between consenting adults was illicit. I would have said this because that was the way it was propagandized to me from all sources without pause throughout my entire use. But no, the normalization of sex with children, who cannot give legal consent, and the Democrat efforts to promote international human trafficking, including coercive prostitution, that is to say, sexual slavery, renders the final restriction of waiting for consent between adults to be null and void. This is not what the enemy is aiming at, and it's certainly not where our culture is going. Moreover, the savage accusation and persecution of menfolk who did indeed gain the necessary grant of consent from his paramour at the time, but which she later regrets and repudiates, nullifies the concept of consent. In the modern day, ladies cannot, as a legal matter, give informed consent to the sex act. This is because any man who fornicates with her can be accused of her later to have had been a rapist, an accusation she can make, or so it seems, with perfect impunity and with no repercussions. Hollywood cannot be cleansed while the general society continues to wallow in such filth. Nor will Hollywood cease making stories that glamorize fornication and adultery until the general audience returns to sanity, chastity, and the self-command of mature sexual beings, that is, the self-command of Christian ladies and gentlemen. Any society that demeans and denigrates motherhood and virginity, but at the same time forbids, heaping shame on sluts, blasphemes against the Virgin Mother of our Lord. Can we reform the popular entertainment industry? If so, we must begin with ourselves, in prayer and in fasting.